Right, we're going to be talking about volume, intensity, and frequency. The three-way balancing act for our training. These are the most important training principles for our programming, for whatever workout split we're doing, whatever workout we're doing, however it is we're training. These are the three things we need to nail in order to make progress. So let's first things first speak about volume. What is volume? Volume, also known as tonnage, is the amount of sets, the amount of reps, and the amount of weight we do all times together creates our volume or our tonnage. So if we did 5 sets of 10 kilos for 10 reps, that would give us a tonnage of 500 kilos or a volume of 500 kilos, for example. It is quite simply the workload that we do in those sessions. Now, that can get quite confusing, but we'll continue. Well, hopefully you'll make sense of this. We have intensity. This is the rate of perceived exertion, how difficult our workout is, the amount of reps in reserve we have, the intensity. It literally is there in the name. How intense is that workout? How hard is it? How high does our blood pressure go? How high does our heart rate go? How hard are we working? And we will oftentimes notice that the higher intensity forms of training are often the heavier lifts with the lower volume. So when we have a high volume sort of workout style, it might be a bit easier than when we have a lower volume, higher intensity with heavier weights. So even though we're lifting more weight on the bar, we're technically lifting less volume, less tonnage across the session, but the intensity is higher. That's where the trade-off between the two comes. We're either sacrificing intensity for volume or volume for intensity, vice versa, just like a seesaw. And then the third component we have, I'm sure there's dozens more we could contemplate adding, but we'll stick with 3 for now. We have frequency. This is the amount of times that a muscle group or a set of muscles or a system of muscles, as CNS, for example, is trained in a week or in a given amount of time before it is then trained again. So for example, if we're running push-pull legs rest, the frequency for all muscle groups would be twice a week. So this is where the balancing act comes. The frequency we do will dictate the amount of volume and intensity we can do. The higher the frequency, the lower the volume, the lower intensity, because we will be doing it more often, so we'll need to recover. And as we train more often, those recovery windows are shorter, so we can perform less total workload. If the frequency is lower, we can get away with doing more volume, more intensity, more of both in those sessions, because we have more time to recover between. So there's a balancing act of whether you're doing little hard sessions often, or you're doing easy high volume sessions often, or whether you're doing very hard sessions not very often, or you're doing very high volume sessions not very often. But it will often work out that the amount that you do tonnage wise in a session, the amount you do intensity wise in a session will go down the more closely those workouts are all put together, and the further they are spread apart, you'll have more effort to put into more volume, more effort to put into more intensity. So let's make a good and simple example of this for you to see. We have our output and we have our time on our graph. So let's imagine our volume is incredibly high for one session. So we'll be training, our volume will be incredibly high. Our intensity can be anywhere on this axis. The higher our intensity is, the less frequent we'll be able to perform these workouts, because both our volume and our intensity are very high. So our output over time, after doing those high intensity and high volume activities, will drop down significantly, and it will take a long time for us to get back to doing a session of similar intensity or similar volume. Whereas if we look at doing a session where we have very high intensity, that amount will go down. But if we do that session with very low volume, now when we do that high intensity session, the recovery will be significantly quicker and we will be able to output a significant more amount. So when we do a hard set, we do a hard workout, we do a workout consisting of many hard sets, very high intensity, the recovery time is going to be much longer. Likewise, if we do a very high volume set, a very high volume workout, and we have done a great deal of tonnage, our recovery time will also be very long. If we do a session that is both high in volume and high in intensity, so we do some sets that are high volume, some sets that are high intensity, this is also going to affect our recovery time. And in a way, it will be a mix of both, where both systems are getting strained, so the recovery time will be equal. So what we need to think about doing, and we need to think about optimizing in our output, the amount that we can actually perform, both intensity and volume-wise, is choosing one or the other and not having one impact the other. So if we are training with a low intensity and a high volume, this sort of training style, the Milo Sarchev, high carbohydrate, high volume sort of style of training, our recovery time will be much better. Down our volume output will go, our intensity volume output will stay the same, and we will recover nice and quickly. Vice versa, if we do a high intensity, down that recovery time will go, up that output will go. But if we do a high amount of both, that recovery is going to be significantly sacrificed, and it's going to take us much longer to be able to perform both a high output of intensity and a high output of volume. So what we need to do in that balancing act with that frequency, we need to realize that if we're trying to train, let's say we're trying to train Monday, we're trying to train Tuesday, we're trying to train Wednesday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, all on a high volume, a high intensity workout. After our first session, neither of these systems are ready for us to do hard. After that second session, neither of our systems are ready. Neither of our systems are recovered for high volume or high intensity. If we choose one or the other, our frequency can be a little bit higher. So if we do a high volume session on a Monday, we might be fully recovered and back to it by the Thursday. If we do a high intensity session on the Tuesday, we might be ready, we might be recovered by the Friday, and so on, so forth. If we only stick to one style of training, we might be able to get away with doing something like an upper-lower split, and by the time it comes to do that upper day again, we might do a high volume upper day on Monday, a high volume upper day on a high volume or high intensity upper day on Monday or Tuesday, and then we'll be ready to do another one on the Wednesday. So if we did high volume or high intensity upper, not both, just one, we might be recovered by Wednesday, but we'll definitely be recovered by Thursday, we'll definitely be recovered by Friday. So for those 5 day a week frequencies, we can look at training something like upper lower rest, upper lower upper rest, or upper lower upper rest, upper lower rest. We could look at doing push pull legs, upper lower rest rest. You know, those sorts of splits where we do 5 a week. If we're looking at lowering that volume and lowering that intensity in those sessions, we can get away with doing 6 day splits like push pull legs rest, or upper lower rest, for example. And if we're doing a very high volume or a very high intensity, but we're doing sort of like very high rest, very high recovery, we can do more of like a bro split. So where we'll do one muscle group per day, per workout. So you might do a chest day, a back day, a shoulders and arms day, and a leg day, and have 3 days off. Or we might be looking at doing a full body every other day, and we choose whether we are a high intensity full body every other day or a high volume full body every other day, but we can't do both. We can't do high intensity and high volume and high frequency. We have to choose 2 of those and sacrifice one of the others. Is the balancing act that works, or we do a balance of all 3, a balance of 2, a little sacrifice of one or the other, but you choose what you do. So I'll put some examples on the board now. So we've got 2 columns, we've got a little middle section where we'll say you can do a mid intensity and a mid volume. So if we're looking at training with a high intensity, we're looking at lifting weights, we're going to be wanting a lower frequency, more recovery, more rest times. So that will be more suited to splits like an upper lower, say 5 times a week or 4 times a week on your frequency. We'll be looking at something like a full body every other day, which is a 3.5 times a week frequency on average, because we're training every other day. And we could be also looking at something like a bro split, where we are going to train each muscle group once, and that can either be 5 days a week or 4 days a week, depending on whether we choose to do a separate day for shoulders and arms, or we do a shoulders and arms day. So we do a chest, a back, a shoulders and legs, or a chest, a back, a shoulders, arms and legs sort of split. If we're looking at high volume, we can get away with a little bit higher of a frequency. So we can look at doing something like push, pull, legs, push, pull, legs, and get away with training 6 times a week. This way our volume can be a little bit higher and our frequency is a little bit higher. We can also get away with training upper, lower, upper, lower, upper, lower 6 times. This just needs careful programming to make sure that one upper day, the first day, is focused on maybe the pushing, it's a push focused upper day, and then the second upper day is more of a pulling focused upper day, and then the third one is more of a balanced one. But you're not going to have all 3 upper days with the exact same hammering of all of those upper body muscles. Some of them will be more focused on each, but you'll still train your full upper body, but you just might have a slightly higher emphasis on different parts. Same with those lower days. It might be a quad, hamstring, accessories. It might be a chest, back and arms, sort of focus on each and bias on each. We can also look at doing everyone's favorite push, pull, legs, upper, lower for a 5 times frequency, or we can look at doing an upper, lower, push, pull, legs. It's the same thing, 5 times frequency. We do an upper day, we do a lower day, we rest, we do push, pull, legs, we rest, we go again, or we do push, pull, legs, rest, upper, lower, rest, and we go again. Those splits favor high volume, those splits favor high intensity. You can obviously get away with doing a high intensity push, pull, legs, or a high volume upper, lower, but I'd say these are the way that they lean and are more suited towards training. You can get away with a higher volume workout style like this, and a higher frequency, and you can get away with a higher intensity and a lower frequency and a lower volume here, lower intensity here. It is completely up to you. At the end of the day, the way you enjoy your training is the way you enjoy your training, and training should be enjoyable. That is the first rule, really. If you hate your program, you hate your programming, you hate the exercises, and you hate the workouts, you're not going to be able to put as much as you could into them, so you're not going to get as much as you should out of them. Right, so summarize that, make that a bit simple. More frequency in our training, the more sessions we do per week, the less rest days we have a week, equals the less recovery we'll have, which therefore equals the less volume or intensity we can produce in our sessions. And especially in the case of intensity, requires more recovery than volume. Don't ask me why, don't ask me how, but when you've got a high volume, you can recover, you can do slightly more frequency than when you have a high intensity. And this is mainly due to the fact that when we program high volume sessions, just as a rule of thumb or a complete coincidence, high volume training oftentimes favors itself and ends up working itself to be very machine focused, very braced focused, lots of isolation exercises, and far more local fatigue in our muscles than systemic fatigue and work actual loading through our CNS. So therefore our whole system gets fatigued less from this high volume training, because we're doing isolation exercises to get those volumes up, because those exercises allow us to reach those higher volumes. Whereas on those high intensity, we want to be lifting heavier weights. Heavier weights, what can we choose? Heavier exercises. We end up doing compounds, we end up doing squats, deadlifts, bent over rows, RDLs, all of these high intensity, old school movements, compound movements that are heavier, actually loading and give more systemic fatigue and more fatigue on our CNS. Therefore, we need more recovery, not to recover from the local fatigue we get like in high volume training, but to recover from the systemic fatigue like we get in high intensity training. So you might see this confusion where people will do high intensity and think that they can recover and train 6 times a week, every day of the week, all the time, and eventually they get beat down, they plateau, and they say, this is unmanageable, this isn't possible, lifting heavy isn't for me. That's because there's not got enough recovery, because they've confused the two. They've trained in a high volume way in the past. They think they can recover the same on a high intensity way, and vice versa. They might go from switching from a high intensity style of training and say, oh, I want to do a bit more fluff work, a bit more isolation, a bit more pump work, a bit more like a bodybuilder on my cut kind of thing, because the two are often confused. People think high volume is bodybuilding, high intensity is strength and powerlifting. Not the case at all. Both are completely optimal and adequate for hypertrophy. Just pick your poison and eat the right diet for either. But you'll see them go from doing a high volume to a high intensity and think the recovery is the same, but it's not quite. You need a little more recovery for high intensity, a little less for high volume. If you're doing a hybrid of both, I'd err on the side of going for that higher recovery as well, just in case, because you don't want to beat yourself down. So we're going to get on to where we left off. We're going to talk about isolations versus compounds. So I just said that isolation exercises favor themselves for this higher volume sort of training. And I said that compound exercises are favored more for this higher intensity sort of training. Now, this is not a rule of thumb. This is just the way that programming seems to be, that when people do compound exercises, they do them heavy, and when they do isolation exercises, they do them light. But you can do heavy isolation exercises, and you can do light compound exercises, vice versa, and they both work. It's just the benefit of an isolation exercise is that we are more braced, there is more local fatigue, we are able to focus on doing one muscle at a time, we're not confusing our nervous systems, doing complicated multi-joint movements, we're just doing something simple, something small, and it's oftentimes in an arcing movement pattern and isolation, whereas a compound will be oftentimes a multi-joint exercise. It requires a little bit more focus, it has a bit more CNS fatigue, oftentimes it's actually loading, and oftentimes it will be moving a bar in a straight line. So compound exercises will train multiple muscles at once. Isolation exercises by nature and by name will only train one muscle at a time. So we will have a primary mover in a compound, we'll have secondary movers, we'll have stabilizers, and in isolations we'll only really have a primary mover and everything else will hopefully be acting as a stabilizer, so we can focus on isolating that muscle. So when we look at doing our programming, we want to put our emphasis on what is most important to us. And what most important to us, most important to bodybuilding, is growing. And growing is progressive overloading. So we need to choose which one we do first. Do we do our isolations first? Do we do our compounds first? If we're looking at progressing, our compound exercises, they should take priority. We should do them first. If we're looking at progressing an isolation exercise, we should do that first. Let's say two people, we've got someone who's got lacking medial delts, side of his shoulders don't look good. Start his session off doing his dumbbell lateral raises, his cable lateral raises, those isolation exercises, then get on with doing some compounds, some bench press, so forth. The other guy, he's got a bit of a small chest, his shoulders are fine, he'll start off doing the compound, do the bench press, do those dumbbell flies, cable flies later on in the session. You choose what you want to progress. The most important part of the session comes first, everything else comes afterwards. So there is no, you have to do compounds first, you have to do isolations first. If you do your isolations first, you will pre-fatigue yourself to those compounds, you won't be able to lift as much. If you do those compounds first, it's not so deleterious to those isolations, so just bear that in mind. If you're looking at training compound exercises with a high volume, you need to be careful of your CNS, obviously, because high volume on your central nervous system might give you a bit of a battering, might sabotage the rest of your workout. If you do 10 sets of deadlifts, you might not be able to stand up straight afterwards. You might not be able to complete your workout. You might not be able to walk tomorrow. You might hurt your lower back. If you do too high of intensity within proper form on your deadlifts to start, you might sabotage your session, but you won't build up all of those metabolic stress, those metabolites from doing all that, getting a crazy lower back pump and assassinating your session. So just bear that in mind. If you're going to take those compound exercises and do a super high volume, just make sure they're not ones that hurt your lower back with incorrect form or anything such like that. But if you're going to do high intensity on isolation exercises, you need to make sure that you're not sacrificing your form and you are still isolating muscles. You're not cheating reps, you're not cheating machines, you're not putting in secondary movers and other things to help you take an isolation exercise to a high intensity state, but you just end up ego lifting and cheating and you're no longer isolating your muscles or training properly. So in both cases, you need to be careful that you're not well, in the case of doing high volume compounds, that you're not putting in the secondary movers and the stabilizers to take over the weight. And in the case of high intensity isolation, you're making sure that you are still training with proper form, proper bracing, and it is just an isolation, and you're not throwing in extra movement. Like when you do your triceps, you're not pushing down with your body to add more weight to the stack. You're not swinging with your dumbbells and your biceps with your legs to put more weight. You are still doing proper isolation, proper form, proper bracing. So just briefly, we're going to talk about some nutrition, because we've talked about lots of lifting. High volume does require high carb. High carbohydrate intake is required when we are doing high volume to get the absolute most out of it, because our output, our volume is high, so we're going to need more energy to keep up with that demand. Where do we get energy for lifting weights from? Carbohydrates. It's quite simple, people. If you're going to do a high volume workout, you need to have a high carbohydrate pre-workout. You need to have a high carbohydrate diet, full stop. You need to make sure that you're not putting lots of fats pre, intra or post workout. Ideally we want low or no fats pre, post and intra, whether we're doing high carb or not, because they slow down our digestion of those carbohydrates and they'll get in the way of getting those carbohydrates to our muscles to promote that high volume style of training. So just bear that in mind. If you're doing high volume, you're doing lots of isolations, lots of high volume in your sets, lots of frequency, however it may be. If you're more focused on the high volume, you will need to focus on those carbohydrates just a little bit more than if you're doing high intensity. You can get away, you'll still want high carbohydrates, but it might not be the be all and end all. You can still train on a high intensity diet with moderate fats as opposed to low fats and high carbs. So just there for a little bit of balance. A high intensity style of training, you can get away with a more moderate and balanced diet, but a high volume training, to make the absolute most out of it, you are going to need to have high carb and low fat diet.